Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In this bonus author interview, I sit down with Christopher Goscha and we discuss his new book, Vietnam, A New History. Vietnam is, spoiler alert, more than just the war that would engulf the region and the United States of America for a 12-year period in the 1960s and 1970s. It's a lot more. It's in many ways the nexus of a number of different cultures and movements. His book is very thorough and will give you a total understanding of everything that you would need to know about this region and the people who inhabit it. It's a rich history. We delve into the distant past, connections with Western civilization, and more. The book, as always, is available for purchase right now. There's a link in the show notes. You can click it to get to it. It's available anywhere. So with further ado, here's the interview. All right, as I mentioned moments ago, I'm sitting down here with historian Christopher Goscha, and we're talking about his new book, Vietnam, A New History. And that word, if you're in America, brings up certain feelings. Most Americans, when they hear the word Vietnam, think of the war that cut the nation almost in half. Yet, as you begin in the beginning, pointing out in your book, America was hardly the first imperial power to intervene in Vietnam. And I'm maybe using that term anachronistically at that point, but I'm going to use it for simplicity. What was it, and what maybe makes it still, that is, makes Vietnam still such an enticing and essential prospect for imperial powers looking to expand?
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to your podcast. It's a real pleasure and it's a real honor. I think you're right, though. Americans, they know Vietnam by the war. They know it as kind of this S-shaped country, which was divided in half in the middle of the 20th century after the French got out of their war with the Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, the government that was led by Ho Chi Minh. Then the Americans took over and supported a southern Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh. Northern Vietnam. So yeah, it's this S-Vietnam that we know divided in half during the Vietnam War and has only been united back into its kind of S form since the fall of Saigon. 50 years ago this year, by the way, in a couple months, we'll celebrate that anniversary. So yeah, it does occupy an important place in the American imagination. And, let's be honest, a lot of folks, they have fathers, grandfathers who were involved in the war as well. Your question's a great one. It's something that interests me greatly is what is it that made this small S-like country divided in half or not so interesting for so many people? And it is true, if we start in the 20th century, it clearly was important for the Americans. And then before the Americans, it was the French. Before the French, it was the Japanese. And then we can even go back in time. And so if we go back in time, and I'm going to try to answer your question this way, I think that there are places in the world, for the better and for the worst, that are gateways. And because they're gateways, they're coveted. Because they're on the edge of one empire, for example, Vietnam was on the edge of this massive empire, which, unlike the Roman Empire, still exists. It's called China. It's kind of a gateway. So if your listeners, they might want to take a look at a map after we're done, perhaps, and you can see that Vietnam's in this unique position where it's between East Asia and Southeast Asia. It's between the Indian Ocean world, that goes all the way, beyond Southeast Asia to the Middle East across this massive ocean. So it's linked to the Indian Ocean world, but at the same time, it's linked to the Pacific Ocean as well, which is what brought it into contact with the Americans. So what's interesting is that I do believe, and I try to show in the book, that Vietnam was coveted. It was in a place that was coveted by big empires that touched up against each other. If I can just go on for one more second, what I find fascinating is that you have the Americans, the French, and the Japanese. It's in the 20th century. I think most of our listeners, they kind of know about a little bit of that, certainly the Americans. But what they might not know is that when the Mongols, yes, the Mongols, in the 13th century got rolling, and they went all the way to Baghdad across Eurasia, the Silk Road. They also went all the way to the border with Vietnam, the northern border, when the Mongols overthrew the Chinese in the late 13th century. What I knew but didn't really understand that well was Kublai Khan, who ruled the China for the Mongols. He wanted Vietnam, and he invaded it 3 times at least. And each time the Vietnamese beat them back. But why did he want it? And this is really interesting, is that Kublai Khan, he knew that Vietnam was linked to the Indian Ocean world and to its riches. So he went by the Silk Road overland, but he wanted to go by the maritime Silk Road as well. So you can see that Vietnam's been in this position for centuries. And just it's a very long answer to your very short question, but when the Chinese finally threw out the Mongols and created their own empire, and it's the Ming Empire, M-I-N-G, and that was in 1368. What's interesting is that the third emperor of the Ming dynasty at the beginning of the 15th century, he invaded, occupied Vietnam for 20 years, and the Vietnamese fought him back again in a very violent war. But why did the Ming do this? In part, they did it because they wanted to get to the Indian Ocean. And again, it was at exactly that time, the early 15th century, that the Chinese came rolling into Vietnam, that they also sent their 7 or 8 expeditions all the way into the Indian Ocean. That's a long answer to a short question. I really apologize for that, but I want to make the argument, and it's kind of the argument I make in the book, is that this country, for better or worse, maybe a little bit like Ukraine as well on the western side of Eurasia, it's a gateway. It's a gateway. Ukraine, we know, is a gateway between kind of Central Asia and Western Europe. And I would say that Vietnam, to a certain extent, is something of a gateway between kind of Eastern Eurasia, China, and the Indian Ocean. And when the Americans come rolling in, the Pacific Ocean as well. That's a long answer. I apologize for that, but you asked me an interesting question.
By all means. I mean, I think the other thing I think is interesting about that is we think of the Mongols as these terrific conquerors, this war machine that really is only stopped at a couple of places. They make it, I believe, 2 attempts to invade Japan, and you could argue that it's really the ocean that turns them back both of those times. But you can't make that same argument in Vietnam. There's no sort of divine intervention. I think what they learned is what a lot of people are going to learn, which is there are some places in the world that are gateways. Then there are also some places in the world that are really hard to conquer and hold on to. And a lot of modern people are going to find that out too about Vietnam. You know, Afghanistan is one of those places too, where it's just, oh, that is a tough place. If you're going to try to set up shop and dominate the people there, you're in for it. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I had another sort of broad question. And that is, I got this idea when I was reading the book that we do tend to think about nation states like Vietnam, and I really mean states that were colonized at some point, were part of someone's colonial apparatus. And you'll see this a lot of times in textbooks where it'll say pre-colonial, post-colonial history, and it'll kind of draw that line down a map. And as I was reading the book, I just kept thinking, like, yeah, this is definitely a mistake as we're doing this. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, because it was so clear to me as I was digging into the book.
Sure. Well, it's another great question. When I was asked to write the book, it was kind of the basic books and Penguin before. They asked me to write kind of a general history of Vietnam. So it could, in my case, it's a general history of Vietnam. It could be a general history of Egypt. It could be a general history of China, Great Britain, any country that you like. But if it is one of these countries that, as you say, would fall into a colonial apparatus run by the Westerners, it does and it has led those of us writing these general textbooks on countries, for example, to have to choose. And we always have to choose when we write, right? I think you would agree with that. We always have to set up some sort of a periodization that we're going to use. When I was conceiving my book, though, I wanted to be careful because there's a danger in picking 1858 for Vietnam when the French came knocking on the door. There's a danger in picking 1842 for China when the British, with the Opium Wars, came knocking on the Chinese door, as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners do as well. Just to pick maybe another example, how about 1798 in Egypt when Napoleon came rolling into Egypt? And when we set up our books, a lot of us, and I can understand to some extent, we saw those dates as that's when the modern period began. That's when the West came. A lot of the books they have the West opened up the China, opened up Vietnam, opened up Egypt, brought in modernization, all those things that we associate with modernity. I won't name them, but I think our listeners will know what they are. And we have to pick again, dates at which we start our books. But I wanted to be careful in my book to say, be careful when you pick these dates because they black out a lot of other stuff that happened before. And a lot of those things can really help us to better understand that which would happen after. And so I know we're talking about Vietnam, but you can't talk about China without talking about the remarkable modernity, for example, of the Song dynasty between the 9th and the 12th century. If you start in 1842, you miss the Ming, that's for sure. And I think you can make an argument that had the Ming kept on trucking, if I can put it that way, in the Indian Ocean, had they not pulled their ships back, and these were big expeditions during the first half of the 15th century, the map of the world could have been a lot different. So that's important, and it's the same for Vietnam. If you choose 1858 to start everything, you miss a lot of what came before. And maybe to answer your question, you miss certain levels of modernity that existed in Vietnam before 1858. You miss the fact that Vietnam was an empire itself, like the Ming were as well. And it's not just a French empire, but there was actually a Vietnamese empire. And believe me, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Cham, they're as much aware of the Vietnamese empire as they are of the French empire. Do you know what I mean? So those are two examples of things you can miss. You can miss pre-Western forms of modernity, and you can miss pre- and non-Western forms of.
Yeah, and I think this is a Western history podcast, obviously, but try not to define everything in terms of Western definitions. That's the problem when a lot of times when different textbooks will talk about this is progress now. Well, they mean progress from a Western standpoint, and that's not necessarily fair.
But I would just say I have absolutely nothing against teaching Western civilization or Chinese civilization or Eastern civilization. But I would actually add to what you say is that it makes history more interesting when we can compare the fact that there's different forms of imperialism, different forms of modernity that we can talk about. So my book, I think you might recall, is that it's not really hostile to the West. It's just trying to open it up to the rest, if I may.
Yeah, it's a perfect way of putting it. And I think that's a great way of understanding history, to be honest with you. Let's talk a little bit more about Vietnam specifically now. I want to start, and I am using these terms anachronistically because, of course, there was no such thing as with quotes around it, China or Vietnam at this time. But I wonder if you could start to talk about the relationship between, we could say at least the Chinese and the Vietnamese in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, sort of when we're going back, we're really kind of starting the interaction between those two cultures. What did that look like? And I guess I will say for listeners, if you're not familiar with the topography and geography, it is actually a little helpful to take a quick glance at a map and just see the physical relationship between the two, because it's kind of obvious that there's going to be an interaction.
Sure. Well, I would say, at the time which the Roman Empire was coming into being on the western end of Eurasia in the Mediterranean, obviously in Rome. Call it the third, fourth, fifth, sixth century before the Common Era. But when it really started to take off, as you know, I don't know, let's call it the third century before the Common Era, you have something similar going on the eastern side of Eurasia. You have something similar going on in what we call China today, between the Yellow River, if you look on that map, and the Yangtze River. You've got a core, a little bit like Rome and the Mediterranean was a core. There's a core group here as well in China. And it's in that area between those two huge rivers that cross all of China that you have the birth of the Qing dynasty, Qin. You have the birth of the Han dynasty, Han. And the Han dynasty, third century before the Common Era to the third century of this era, it coincided with the Roman Empire, more or less. The dates aren't quite the same, but the two communicated with each other. The two on both ends of Eurasia, we have these huge empires that came into being, or that it got bigger and bigger. They communicated with each other by the Silk Road, as I think most of your listeners will know. But again, I'm very favorable to the West and the rest, and it's interesting to put them on kind of a parallel framework. So to answer your question, in the Far East, in what we call China today, you have the birth of the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty will slowly but surely move to the south. And it will move into what we call southern China today. And eventually it will move into what we call northern Vietnam today. So you have this core empire. Let's just call it China. We have to give them names. We have to call it something. And so you have this Chinese empire, which is moving southward, just like kind of the Roman Empire moves all around the Mediterranean and towards the east, so to speak. At the same time, you have a lot of small polities. You have tribes, just like you have the Gauls, in what we call Western Europe today. So you have the tribes, small polities, small kingdoms in southern China, northern Vietnam. And the name that the Chinese would give to them would be, well, one would be barbarian, much like the Romans would do as well. But another would be the Yuan, Yuan, which we translate as kind of the Viet people. So you have these Viet people, and they're situated to the south of the Chinese Empire. So you have the emergence, for example, of a southern kingdom of Vietnam, which would be in the second century BC. You also have a little bit before that, in the third century before the Common Era, you have near Hanoi the birth of a state that's called the I don't want to get into too many words, but the Kolowa or Ao Viet Kingdom. So you have two small kingdoms in what we call northern Vietnam today, that briefly existed independently, like other polities in Western Europe did as well, until the Han came moving in, just like the Romans came moving in, and conquered them for the better or for the worst. And it was often violent. There's no need to paper that over. It was often violent because that's what conquerors do. And the Vietnamese, I'll say that word, the Viet, would enter into the Han Empire, which would be taken over by the Tang Dynasty later. And for 1,000 years, those brief Vietnamese kingdoms that existed before the Common Era disappear. They're integrated into the Roman Empire, much like the Gaul were integrated into the Roman Empire as well, until the Western Empire fell, in the 4th century or the 5th century, depending on how you want to define the end of the Western Empire in Rome. So you have something similar that's going on. The Gaul, who will eventually become, let's say, the French, they owe a lot to this big empire. The Roman Empire, just as the Vietnamese were part of the Chinese Empire until the 10th century. We'll get to that in a moment if you want, but that's a long time that they were in it. I think what's maybe interesting for your listeners to keep in mind, and we get back to this kind of this geopolitical question that you posed in the beginning: why is this place always so coveted? I think it's important maybe for your listeners to remember that if the Western Roman Empire fell in the 3rd or 4th century, and if it never came back, we can't say the same about what happened in East Asia. The Han Empire would fall, but for better or for worse, not without a lot of fighting between the states, the Chinese Empire would piece itself back together again. So in Western Europe, people tried to rebuild the Roman Empire. You could argue that Hitler was the latest to try to do it. It didn't work. The Chinese Empire is there to this very day. And so, even when the Vietnamese left the Chinese Empire, when the Tang Dynasty fell apart in the 9th and 10th centuries, and the Vietnamese will regain their independence, if you want, in the 10th century, they always had to deal with this massive empire with which they shared a border. And this, I think, is something that's really important. Again, another long answer, Adam, to a very short question. Sorry about that.
No, perfectly okay. I mean, it is worth remembering that, and I'm going to use the word China, throughout the centuries, its borders have changed, the names have changed, but you can always see it, and there are reverses, of course. There are times when the kingdom is in retreat, but even up through the Qing, the last imperial dynasty, you have additions to China that dramatically increase its size to what it really is today, to its modern borders. If you kind of look at China pre-Qing, there's no Tibet, there's not a lot in the north. So those that ever growing threat. Yeah, it's right. It'd be like if suddenly, I'm just going to say, like, suddenly in the 9th century, Charlemagne is able somehow to piece back together the entirety of the Roman Empire, and it has a new name.
The world would be very different. If that were the case, believe me, the world would be a very different place today. And obviously, a lot of people dreamed of that happening, not least of all Charlemagne. But I think your point is extremely well taken. But as I think you're saying, it never happened. So France never had to deal with, a big Roman Empire neighbor, so to speak, or the British never had to deal, a little island over there like the Vietnamese in a way, having to deal with a continental empire that reconstituted itself like the Chinese did. Sorry, Adam, I cut you off because I think you're making a parallel that I find absolutely fascinating.
Conversation. That's what I enjoy about it. But let's talk about Vietnam for a little bit after China begins a little bit of a retreat. So it goes into this period of decline, 9th, 10th century ish, and it isn't able to maintain as much control over the peripheries anymore as it once was, and that will change again. But during that time period, what happens in Vietnam is, do we have a series of kingdoms? Do we have one kingdom? Like, what if we were to sort of take a snapshot in history as China's fading away temporarily? What would we see?
So you mean after the Vietnamese obtained their independence in the 10th century? Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's true. What they would see would be the fading away of the Tang Dynasty that had been going on for a good 100 years or so, which created opportunities for them, for various people who were within the Chinese Empire who wanted to take advantage of its falling apart in order to create this post-colonial state, which we're going to call Dai Viet was the name. We can call it Vietnam if you want. But the thing that's important is that the Vietnam that we see today did not exist in that S form at this time in the 10th, 11th centuries, and all the way until later, as we'll see maybe. Vietnam was northern Vietnam. Vietnam was, centered on its capital in Hanoi. So what did they see? Well, on the one hand, they had to create an increasingly effective, centralized monarchical state. That was the first thing. They had to deal with civil wars. I'm going to be honest with you. It's classic. Whenever an empire breaks up, there's obviously different people who go after power. That happened. But let's just say by the beginning of the 11th century, we do have a unified, independent Vietnam that exists. And so it's going to try to improve agriculture, improve commerce, tap into this international trade in the Indian Ocean that I mentioned briefly a moment ago, in order to solidify its state. There'll be already the Vietnamese will start to look towards the south to the Cham people. This is a people who dominated what we call central Vietnam, even parts of southern Vietnam. They had been there since the beginning of the Common Era. So the idea that Vietnam was only ethnic Vietnamese is problematic, just like China wasn't just the Han people. Nonetheless, we could go into other examples as well. But they were tempted by the South. They were tempted by the pull of the Indian Ocean. They were tempted by the lands of others, and the Vietnamese were conquerors from an early period. It didn't really get going till a little bit later on, but nonetheless, that was where they looked as well. They always kept their eye on what was going on in the north with the Chinese. That was important. And of course, the Mongols came rolling in as well in the 13th century in particular. So there was a lot going on for this coveted part of the world, as I mentioned a moment ago. So statecraft, state building, tapping into the international commerce, a little bit of colonial movement towards the south. But oh my goodness, we've got to watch out with what's going on in the north, the Mongols, and then the Chinese would come as well after the Mongols.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I want to talk about the Ming Dynasty then becomes expansionist once again in the 14th century. And so how did the Vietnamese, and it is a very aggressive kingdom. So how did the Vietnamese fare? I think it's 1368 or so is the year after that point. How did they manage this new, very aggressive Chinese kingdom to the north?
Yeah, well, as I think some of your listeners will know, the Mongols will start to pull out, and the Chinese will push them out of China. Excuse me, in the 14th century, it gets rolling in the 1340s, 1350s. We get to the 1360s, and you have the future emperor Hongwu. Hongwu, who will defeat the Mongols, drive them out, and he creates his capital in the city of Nanjing in the south, and later he will move it to Beijing in the north. So he comes to power, as you said, in 1368. Now, the first emperor, he will die in 1398. For the first 30 years, he was not interested in Vietnam. He was interested in the southwestern part of what we call China today. So as you said about the Qing dynasty later on, they would add different blocks to China, for example, Tibet. What's interesting is that the Ming dynasty, Hongwu, this is the Ming, when he won in 1368, he created the Ming dynasty. His name is Hongwu. He will colonize what we call Yunnan province today. And so he adds that. Actually, the Mongols had conquered it before, and he keeps it. The Mongols gave it to him, and he will keep it, what we call Yunnan province. Now, what's interesting, Adam, is that he warned his sons, don't overreach, fellas. Don't overreach. Don't overreach into the Indian Ocean. I know that Kublai Khan and the Mongols wanted to do that. And don't overreach in Dai Viet or in Vietnam, in northern Vietnam today. So he warned them. The third emperor who took over in 1402 did not listen. And his name is Yongle, Yongle. And this is someone who had dreams of expansion, and he went to work on them. He went to work on them in the Southwest as well, like his father had done. But he's going to do two things, as I mentioned a moment ago. On the one hand, he's going to send 7, sometimes we say 8 huge expeditions into the Indian Ocean to get to the West. Not to Europe, but to the western side of the Indian Ocean. So this is a century before the Portuguese, go around southern Africa, et cetera, and get to Malacca. But he wants to get there for the same reason as the Portuguese and the Spanish and everybody else later, the riches of this part of the world. So that's really, really important. And what we've learned over the last 10 to 15 years from some amazing research is that these were in part military missions. So the Iberians, the Portuguese, weren't the only ones using force, gunpowder weapons, and soldiers. So were Yongle's ships. So this is important. Second thing that he did is he decided to invade Vietnam. I won't go into the details. They're kind of complicated. But in the end, he said, let's go. We're going in. Dai Viet was part of China before. It will be part of China today. So he got rid of the word Vietnam, or Dai Viet as it was called then, and he made it again the province of Shaoxi. I won't give you the spelling for that, but let's just say the idea was it's not Vietnamese, it's not Dai Viet, Vietnam, whatever you want. It's Chinese now. And so he would go in. And what's interesting, I think there's two things. There's a lot going on here, but just to answer your question, one, he went in because he saw it as a platform for getting into the Indian Ocean trade, just like the Mongols tried to do before him. So he wants to control. It's quite interesting. You can see that the Chinese, and you can see a little bit of it's going on today as well. They want this coast, and they want to control the coast in order to project the overland Silk Road, if you like, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the seaborne Silk Road across the Indian Ocean. That's one thing why he wanted Vietnam. The second thing, and this is important, is that unlike in southwestern China, unlike his father, he said no to indirect rule. He said no to relying on kings and families and chieftains. You know what I mean? And we kind of, you guys, I run the show, but we'll let you keep your little kingdoms. And I don't say that in a pejorative way. You keep your little kingdoms here in Yunnan, in the south, but you can do what you were doing before. In Vietnam, he does something different. Assimilation, direct rule. And this creates, if you go too hard with direct rule as a colonizer, it can get you in trouble. And I'm sure you and I can find some examples across the whole world where that happens. But when you hit people hard saying you are no longer Vietnamese, you must learn Chinese, when you burn their books, and that's what the Ming would do. This is all proven. You create resistance, you create identity as well, call it whatever you want. But the Ming contributed to kind of a reinforcement of a Vietnamese identity, hostile to the Chinese. There were Vietnamese at the beginning who were saying, you know what, we can work with you. We can cooperate with you. But when the Chinese really adopted very, very harsh measures against the Vietnamese, it created resistance. I won't go into the details, but there's a man who would rise up. His name is Le Loi. He would be the founder of the Le dynasty, and he would drive the Chinese out in the final end game would be in 1427 and 1428. The invasion would happen, in 1406 and 1407, 20 years. It's a 20-year war. If you don't mind, Adam, there's some new research, and this might interest your listeners. You're working on the western side of Eurasia, Western civilization, which is great. One thing that some new research has shown is that contrary to what we thought about the military revolution and gunpowder, the idea was, the Chinese invented gunpowder, but it was the Europeans who developed it because they were warring a lot. They had the science, they had the application, et cetera, et cetera. And that's true. That's true. The thing that we didn't realize until the last 10 or 15 years with just some amazing research is that actually the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Koreans, they also beat up on each other, and they also created gunpowder weapons, cannons, handguns, grenades. I could go on. But what is really perhaps interesting, I kind of cheated. A third thing about the Sino-Vietnamese War, the Chinese-Vietnam War with the Ming, is that it was a gunpowder war. It was a gunpowder war. And towards the end of the war, it's a little bit like Ho Chi Minh getting artillery and using it against the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This man named Le Loi would get his hands on Chinese modern gunpowder, and he would turn it on the colonizers, and he would defeat them, not in a guerrilla battle, but in a siege battle, similar to what was going on in Western Europe in the 15th, 16th century. And that would happen in 1427, I believe it lasted for 5 or 6 months, something like that. Anyways, I thought that might be of interest for your listeners, is that what's going on the western side of Eurasia and Europe, there's some similar things going on, and you see it in the Ming-Dai Viet War of the early 15th century.
Well, I'm always interested in it. I know that we're not necessarily talking about Chinese history today, but I'm always interested in looking at sort of the pace of civilizations throughout history, and the idea of, they used to be called, I think, the treasure fleets, but those the 8 fleets that were sent around to the Indian Ocean. And, that is, That's not too far from when Europe is going through the Black Death, essentially in 1348, 1349. So this very much still medieval Europe. They're going to be fighting the Hundred Years' War still for a long time with longbows, and swords and picks, and you're talking about the Sino-Vietnamese War, where gunpowder is being used effectively at this point. So
But the French did use in the Battle of Castillon. They did use gunpowder weapons to put an end to the war with the English. What was it, 1453, if I'm not wrong? And they did that thanks to gunpowder weapons as well. So what's interesting, I agree totally with what you just said. But what's interesting too is the parallel uses of gunpowder technology in warfare and state consolidation and in statecraft as well. So I agree that it's kind of dark still in the Middle Ages, but it's quite clear that things are moving across all of Eurasia from the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And the fact that the Ming sent their expeditions west to the west, and then the Iberians sent them towards the east. It's quite clear that everybody, they knew what was going on. Even in the Middle Ages in Europe, they had good information. They knew, Marco Polo, he went to Vietnam. He went to China, of course, but he went to Vietnam. Ibn Battuta, we know he went to China, but he also went to Vietnam. I'm just saying, the world was a very interconnected place, and it's interesting to see kind of the similar things happening on both ends, at least at that time, 15th, 16th, 17th. And after that, things do change in the West. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I think that and you're exactly right. And 1453 is actually to me, it's actually one of those quintessential dates in the world history, because while you have the French, you're correct, finally using small scale cannons to finish off the bedeviling longbows of the English. At the same time, you have the Ottoman Turks using cannons that same year to put an end once and for all to the Byzantine Constantinople.
To the Roman Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, so that one half fell, as we know. You don't need me to tell you that, but that other half was there. But as you say, the Ottomans, I don't know if it's Mehmed II or not, but anyways, he had some pretty big cannons that he was using that were, similar to what the Chinese, the Ming, were putting together as well. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. And so kind of thinking about globalizing forces for a second, you did write in the book, I was interested in this, you wrote, in short, religions like empire are globalizing forces because, as weapons are moving around, religions and ideas are moving around during this time period, especially Christian missionaries are starting to get their feet under them. And so I'm curious as to what role Christianity and Christian missionaries starting in about the 15th century plays in Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm gonna. It's true that question is one that I'm very much interested in, and it gets back to what I said a little bit earlier to your question about Vietnam, for the better and the worse, being linked to the rest of the world, and you can see it in religious terms. You can see it in religious terms. It was linked by maritime routes from the early in the Common Era to the Indian Ocean. So what does that mean religiously? And I'm going to get to Catholicism. Sorry, I'm setting you up for another long answer here. But you have the exchanges, the seaborne exchanges between Vietnam and the Indian Ocean, which brought what? Hinduism. We think of Vietnam, it's like China. Well, not quite, because it's this kind of this platform, this crossroads, So that central part where the Cham people were until the 15th, 16th century, that's where Hinduism came into Vietnam. So if you or your listeners go to Vietnam, go to a place like Hue. Go outside of Hue. Yes, it was the imperial capital. We'll maybe get to that, in a little bit. It was for a time the Vietnamese imperial capital, but it was a Cham capital before that. And you have Vishnus and you have Shivas, that sort of thing. You have Buddhism, which came into southern and central Vietnam. Obviously, it went into Cambodia as well. Brought in by traders. They were bringing the missionaries. So that's another type of religion that was linked to Vietnam. Third example, this might surprise you, but it's really true, Islam. Why? because the Persians, but the Arabs in particular, from the 9th, 10th, and they really got rolling during the Song dynasty, 10th, 11th, 12th century, when the Song was a major economic powerhouse. They were doing all the transit trade between the Middle East and China, and they would stop over in central Vietnam, and they brought Islam with them. So if you go again to Champa, central Vietnam today, you will see vestiges of Islam. You have mosques, and even in Vietnam, you have mosques even in southern China. Chinese don't always like to talk about that, but it's true. So if we look at Vietnam then from the north, sorry for the long answer, but Vietnam was part of this Chinese empire for 1,000 years. We know that a certain type of Buddhism came via the overland Silk Road, went into China, went to Japan, went to Korea, and it went to northern Vietnam in particular. So you have two strands of Buddhism, the big vehicle and the small vehicle. I won't go into the details, but one came by the seaborne routes and one came by the overland routes through the imperial connection with China. So that's another example. My point now to your question, sorry, is that Christianity, Catholicism, it came like Islam, it came like Buddhism, it came like Hinduism to Vietnam, and it was by the seaborne routes. So once the Ming pulled back their ships, in come the Iberians, the Spanish, through the Philippines, the Portuguese, they're coming across from southern Africa, India, Malacca, and then they'll get to Japan, as you know, and Macau, which they'll create a colony. And so the Iberians in particular were very Catholic. They're going to bring Catholicism with them. So you have Jesuits who come in particular to Vietnam. I won't go into the details. They'll be in China as well. I think most of your listeners will probably know that. But I guess my answer to your question is religions move, but they take root because people on the ground too are interested in them. So the Vietnamese, like the Chinese, like other people as well in Europe, they find something that they want, that they need, that they believe in, that helps them get through the day, that helps them get through their work. All these things that we know about religions. The Vietnamese were no different than anyone else. So yes, Catholicism came. It came early, 16th century, 17th century in particular. You will have Portuguese, French, Catholics. They will go to the northern part of Vietnam in particular. I won't go into the details, but they will find a fertile ground for preaching, just like other missionaries before them. Muslims, Buddhists, Hinduists, if you like, had found converts as well.
And it's just, again, kind of comes back to the original point that we started with of why Vietnam is geographically in such an important place, that it becomes this just almost natural melting pot for different ideas and cultures, because everybody has to move through it or around it if you want to take advantage of these lucrative trade routes, which of course everyone does. And so you have to stop there. And so it's interesting how that is very different from some of the more isolated regions of the world. You might think of a place like Tibet, or maybe a place like, I don't know, Switzerland or something like that. That's hard to get to. But kind of moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I was reading the section about the 17th century in Vietnam, where you're talking about how there's effectively like almost three major military families, a series of military families who are kind of in charge. One of them, the Nguyen, kind of are instrumental in starting to push northern Vietnamese colonization into the south, into around what is eventually going to become Saigon. And so I'm interested in that process where it starts to look like maybe this is going to look like something around unification, but not so much. So if you could explain that a little bit, I thought it was really interesting.
Well, thanks. It's an important question, and there's a lot of work that's still being done on it. It's incredibly detailed, so I don't want to go into too many details. I'm going to simplify just a bit in order to hit on the important point that you made, and by the fact that there were three military houses who will contest for power. Let me just back up real quick, is that this man whose name was Lei Lui, he defeats the Ming. He creates the Lei dynasty in 1428. Let's just say for a century, the Lei dynasty, it works well. He centralizes the state. He borrows a lot from the colonizer, from the Chinese. Obviously, gunpowder weapons. He'll use those against the Cham and to increase the size of Vietnam, which starts to occupy much of central Vietnam now. He will adopt Confucianism, to build a strong monarchical state. Now, as is so often the case, whether it be in Europe, Asia, wherever it might be in the world, there's always problems of succession. There's always problems of backstabbing, palace intrigue and this sort of thing. It happens in Vietnam like it happens everywhere. So what happens is that we get to the beginning of the 16th century, a century after having defeated the Chinese, and the Lei dynasty kind of fades away. They can't control competing factions, military groups. And there's three houses that kind of affirm their power at that time. One is called the Mac, M-A-C. The second is called the Qing, T-R-I-N-H. And the third, who will be the most important eventually, is the Nguyen, N-G-U-Y-E-N. And basically, the two most important families are the Qing and the Nguyen, and they leave the Lei dynasty. The emperor, he remains there, but he becomes a figurehead, Adam. A little bit like the emperor in Japan. Remember when Japan, if you've studied Japanese history, you have kind of a warring period, and then you have a military government that finally comes to power. And it's the military government. They keep the emperor there because he legitimates their power, but he's isolated. And the same thing happens in Vietnam. There's the emperor, the Lei dynasty, obviously he hits his kids and grandkids and all of that. So they leave him in Hanoi. But the real problems begin between the Qing, T-R-I-N-H, and the Nguyen, again, N-G-U-Y-E-N. They want to run the show. They want to run the show. And this really gets started in the 16th century. They don't really start fighting during the 16th century. What happened is that the Nguyen family, it's a warlord family, they say, you know what, let's not fight, we'll head south. So they head south for Hue. And they're going to set up shop in the what will become the imperial capital, their imperial capital eventually, a century later. But the two families, the Qing and the Nguyen, they disagree. They solved the problem at the beginning by the Nguyen heading south in the 16th, in the middle of the 16th century. The thing is that they still consider this to be one state. The problem is that the Qing, they want to run the show from Hanoi because they see themselves as kind of the real leaders with the Lei behind them. And what they will do is try to, it's like the American Revolution, taxes. They will impose heavy taxes on the Nguyen dynasty, not the Nguyen dynasty, sorry, but the Nguyen family in the South. And we get to the early 17th century and the Nguyen say, you know what? We've had enough of this. We're going to go it on our own. And that's very simplified, but I really do believe what I've said is very true. You have this southern Nguyen family that moves southward, a little bit like, after the Americans obtained their independence from the British, they started moving westward. And as you move westward, other possibilities open up. You see things differently in the north as you move to the west. You see things differently in the south. I'm not going to get into slavery and all of that, but I'm just saying that you have a movement of part of the Vietnamese towards the south, and we get to the 17th century, and the Nguyen, they say, you know what? That's enough. We're going our own. Civil war breaks out, Adam. It does break out in the 1620s. There's going to be fighting that goes on for about 60 years. Finally, there's a stalemate in 1672, and excuse me. And then about 50 years later or so, the Nguyen in the South declare their own dynasty, and they set up their imperial capital in Hue. So you have in the northern delta of the Red River, you have the Qing with the Lei as a figurehead. And in the south now, you have this kind of colonial state led by the Nguyen dynasty now and a king. And they all kind of play the game. Oh, we're all still one happy family, but it was a lie. And everybody knew it was a lie. There was two states from that time. So that is, I think, the best way to explain the fact that before the French came, there was a history of two Vietnams. So what we see during the Vietnam War, you opened up our podcast today saying most Americans know Vietnam as it was divided into two halves. Well, actually, a lot of Vietnamese in the past, they also knew Vietnam as being divided into two halves as well.
Well, I think that that's so important for understanding the context and the background to that conflict and to so many other aspects of culture and history, which again is a good reason why it's smart to not just label something pre-colonial and move past it as though it's not going to have relevancy later on. Well, I think we have time for one more question. So I want to jump forward a little bit because I do want to ask about, does Vietnam become unified before the French get there? Specifically in 1802, does Vietnam, and I'm not going to get this name correctly, but under Gai Long, does it become unified, or is that just a mirage? Is it a paper regime that makes it look like it's a unified country, but it's not really? I think we've kind of talked about this idea of different parts of Vietnam. So I think to kind of bring it to a close today, let's talk about, does it get to the point where it is politically unified before a colonial power gets there?
The answer to that question is yes, but not without great difficulty. Of course, you can make an argument for the United States as well. At the end of the 19th century, it almost came unraveled on the Americans, and I'm sure you and I could find other examples where civil war is a very important thing to take into consideration. So Vietnam is no exception to that rule in world history, that it's important to know how difficult it is to create operational, unified nation states, or whatever type of state you want to talk about. Again, it did become unified in 1802 when the leader of the Nguyen dynasty, Zalom, he won a 30-year civil war. I won't go into the details, but it just goes to show that you had that first civil war I talked about in the 17th century, and you'll have another one at the end of the 18th century. It will last for 30 years. And it's a fight kind of between Southerners, Centralers, and Northerners. I'm going to simplify like that. But the leader of the Nguyen family, about which I spoke a moment ago, Zalom, Gialong, he was indeed able to unify the North, the Center, and the South in the S form we recognize to this day on the map that represents Vietnam, with Hanoi in the north, Hue, let's say, in the center, and Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City in the south. It was, however, a fragile affair. It really was. He would go lightly until his death. I believe he died around 1820, 1821, 1822. Sorry, I can't quite remember. But anyways, during that period, he would go lightly because he didn't want to annoy anybody. He wanted to kind of pay off people who had collaborated with him during the Civil War. They could kind of do what they wanted. They could have their own kind of fiefs or fiefdoms, if you like. The Chinese could do what they wanted. You could have he didn't impose a kind of a direct assimilationist type of rule like the Ming did. You know what I mean? So it was more indirect rule. He had good relations with the ethnic minorities. He didn't try to gobble up, their lands or stuff like that. He went lightly with the Northerners who kind of lost, and he's like, okay, it's okay. We can work this out. That would, however, change when his son came to power in the early 1820s. His name was Ming Mang, and he adopted a kind of heavy duty, more of an assimilationist, direct rule approach, which created enemies, and which kind of he was revolutionary in the sense that he was able to centralize Vietnam politically and economically. He did create a lot of enemies, and in particular, he had created a lot of enemies among the Catholics who had supported the Catholics, including the French missionaries, had supported the Nguyen during the Civil War. But Zalom's son would go after the Catholics, and of course, that would allow the French to find a way to get in the mainly in the 1850s when the French would attack in 1858 and begin the colonization process. And they would claim to be doing that to protect French Catholics, which, of course, to some extent they were, but it was a pretext. It was a pretext for colonization. So, again, I come back to the way I answered your question. It's hard to answer real quick, but yes, he did unify Vietnam. His son helped advance that, but not without difficulties, which would come back to haunt them. And the example I give is that the Catholics would look to the French to help them against this kind of heavy-handed policy that was used by Minh Mang.
Well, and I think that's a perfect teaser for where to leave it, because that gets us right up to the point where many audiences are now kind of starting to get familiar with the story. And now there is a tremendous amount that we did not discuss in the book, even prior to the time period that we have. To have a full and complete discussion of this book would take several days of continuous talking, and that's why it's so good. But we don't have time for that, and I don't think I have enough storage space for that either. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming out. The book's available now. It's great. It's for anyone, especially, I would say, especially if you are going to be traveling to Vietnam, which is a beautiful country to visit now. I would highly recommend reading it. It'll give you such a deeper cultural appreciation of the land that you're going into, other than just a land that was a charnel house in the 1960s and 1970s for a period. It's a lot more than that. And I think that this does a great way of explaining that in some real detail. And the detail is what makes it good, let's be honest. So, but thanks so much for coming on. It was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.